Jean Kravis of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust is going to introduce our speaker today.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Adler after a hiatus of a few years. I've heard his lecture before, and he is very well prepared to talk about the subject of the American and the world response to the Holocaust. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully, which is the outcomes show deterioration on both sides. We must remember that we have not only the present but the future to safeguard. Our obligations extend even to generations yet unborn. The unassimilated alien child menaces our children, as the alien industrial worker who has destruction rather than production in mind menaces our industry. Calvin Coolidge, Vice President of the United States, 1922, soon to be President of the United States. Now, Dr. Adler will tell you how he came to these remarks, I'm certain. He studied at the University of New Mexico for his bachelor's degree. He got his MA and Ph.D. from the University of California in Berkeley, and specializing in recent American history, 20th century American history. And he had been part of the Holocaust lecture series before. He has taught here at Sonoma State since 1970 at the Hutchins School. Welcome back, Les.
Thanks, Gene. I can't help but notice a slight difference in the crowd between last week and this week. I don't think there's anything in that. Actually, it takes a lot of pressure off not having that huge auditorium to talk to. I have also been thinking about the placement of this lecture in the series. And in Dr. Zimbardo's lecture last week, he was telling us about the psychology of evil, how any of us, good people, can do evil things. We also, those of you who watched Schindler's List or watched the Academy Awards last night, that there are opposite kinds of people who somehow find their way through the maze of moral dilemmas and do good things despite terrible odds against it, despite dangers, and they are to be highly commended. I'm here today to talk about a third category, and I think there must be a special place in hell for this particular category. This is the category of good people who do nothing, or at times do nothing, when faced with things going on around them that are beyond horrible. And for many of them, I suspect one of the ways of looking at it is that they are beyond belief. Many of the people I'll be talking about today, and unfortunately I'll be talking about this country and its response to the Holocaust. The response was that these things couldn't be going on, and even when faced with undeniable evidence and proof, they found ways to deny it or to avoid the meaning of it. I have a moment of repairs here. The microphone seems to be sliding downhill. The United States may seem somewhat peripheral to the Holocaust. The Holocaust actually was a European event, and you may wonder why talk about the United States response. My answer to that to begin with is that the United States in the 1930s and during the early 1940s was stepping from being a relatively unimportant part of the world community to becoming the dominant player in the world game. America had started its road to empire in the 1890s, had made tremendous leaps in establishing its power, was the dominant industrial power in the world by the 20s, after World War I in particular, and it had a tremendous potential for good during this horrible time. Unfortunately, the United States did not act in a way that promoted beneficial ends. And part of what I want to look at is why that was the case. The United States could have done much more to let refugees in before the Holocaust started. It could have done much more to stop, to at least get the Germans aware of world responses that were likely to be there were they to go through with the types of things they were talking about doing. And by the time the war was going on, the United States was the dominant partner in the Allied war effort. It was in a position to make decisions and have influence that no other power could in shaping the outcome of the war, in setting the priorities in the war. And the United States avoided making any of the issues related to Jews in the war a priority issue until the very tail end of the war, when it was too late to do much of anything at all. So the question is, why did this happen? And I'll be addressing that this afternoon. It's also an issue to keep in mind as we look at what's happening in this post-Cold War world, where there are outbreaks of violence and terror and ethnic cleansing are going on around us. How should we respond? How can we respond? What is morally responsible? Perhaps some of the lessons of what we did and didn't do during the Holocaust will give us some illumination in this regard. I'm going to start by quoting Arthur Koestler, who is a Hungarian Jewish writer. Most famous book was Darkness at Noon. He escaped from Germany to France. He escaped from France to Spain, fleeing the Nazis at these various times. He escaped from Spain to England, where he spent most of the war working as a correspondent, trying to arouse the English public and the world to some of what was going on. His frustration is very clear in the piece I'm going to read. It's a brief editorial statement. It was published first in England and then reprinted in the New York Times in January of 1944. It's called On Disbelieving Atrocities. Arthur Koestler says, "There is a dream which keeps coming back to me at almost regular intervals. It is dark, and I am being murdered in some kind of thicket or brushwood. There is a busy road at no more than 10 yards distance. I scream for help, but nobody hears me. The crowd walks past laughing and chatting. We, the screamers, have been at it now for about 10 years. We started on the night when the epileptic Van der Lubbe set fire to the Parliament. We said that if you don't quench those flames at once, they will spread all over the world. You thought we were maniacs. At present, we have the mania of trying to tell you about the killing of the total Jewish population of Europe. So far, 3 million have died. It is the greatest mass killing in recorded history, and it goes on daily, hourly, as regularly as the ticking of your watch. I have photographs before me on the desk while I am writing this, and that accounts for my emotion and bitterness. People have died to smuggle them out of Poland. They thought it worthwhile. But the other day, I met one of the best-known American journalists over here. He told me that in the course of some recent public opinion survey, 9 out of 10 average Americans, when asked whether they believe that the Nazis commit atrocities, answered that it was all propaganda, lies, and that they didn't believe a word of it. As to this country, that is England, I have been lecturing now for 3 years to the troops, and their attitude is the same. And meanwhile, the watch goes on ticking. What can the screamers do but go on screaming until they get blue in the... To return to the American situation, with this collapsing microphone, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of context to what was going on in America. The United States in the 19th century had been very responsive when there were massacres or later pogroms going on in Europe, Jews or about other people who were being persecuted. The State Department regularly sent out protests to various governments that were attacking their own people or civilian populations. In 1905, when the famous Kishinev pogrom occurred in Russia, public opinion in the United States, in Congress, in the State Department was strongly in favor of protesting. They protested to the Tsarist government what was going on, the persecution of the Jews. It was an issue, and America felt empowered to say something about it and do something about it. But something else was happening about the same time in the United States, which changes this particular attitude. Starting about the 1880s, masses of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Jews, Poles, Slavic peoples, Italians, Greeks, Bulgarians, all sorts of different, very different sorts of people began coming to these shores because of the tremendous industrial expansion the United States was undergoing. They became part of the industrial machine, but they brought with them all of their folkways, all of their different beliefs, and they began to look to people like Calvin Coolidge, that Gene Kravitz mentioned, and to a great many other Americans as though this was an alien, unassimilable body of people, if people they were. They were very different than the old stock Western European types who had populated this continent in the European expansion. They didn't seem to fit. They spoke funny languages. They clustered together in the big city ghettos. They were a danger. They were seen as promoting crime, as somehow being inferior. And one of the movements that was growing at the same time, we've come to call the eugenics movement. There was scientific basis, according to a great many people, including some very famous, that different races had different mental capacities, different moral capacities, and by leaving the doors wide open, weren't we making it very possible that we were going to dilute the Anglo-Saxon genius that had created this country and have it turn into something very different than we had ever imagined? Approximately 30 million people moved to these shores in the 3 decades between 1880 and 1910, and it really upset the nation. A great many of them found their way into the labor movement, where they fought for better wages, better working conditions. They joined socialist parties, they joined labor organizing movements. They appeared to be politically radical as well as socially dangerous, and a movement began which we call nativism, which seems to cycle up and down, as we can see in California, with the economy going down and the feeling going up. This is a very normal trend in history. This was occurring at the same time. As conditions would become worse, there would be more nativism. When things would get a little bit better, it would leave off a little bit. But starting in 1882, America passed its first immigration legislation. Up to that point, there had been no laws on immigration. In fact, there was nobody at the gate checking your entry card. But in the 1880s, a great deal of anti-Chinese agitation here, most primarily, led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, I believe it was. A few decades later, the Japanese were excluded in a gentleman's agreement. So the doors were beginning to creak toward closing. Another way of closing the door was to pass laws or to call for the passage of laws for literacy tests. Obviously, these people were of low intelligence, so well, let's make sure they can read and write, that show that they've got some mental capacity. Professor E.A. Ross of the University of Wisconsin, a famous sociologist at the turn of the century, spoke of his studies of the new immigrants, as he called them. 10 to 20%, he said, are hirsute, low-browed, big-faced persons of obviously low mentality. I have seen gatherings of foreigners in which narrowed, sloping foreheads were the rule. The shortness and smallness of the crania were noticeable. In every face there was something wrong. One might imagine a malicious genie himself by casting human beings in a set of skew molds discarded by the Creator. Obviously, Jews fit this category extremely well, as Americans perceived them. They were prominent, they spoke different languages, they wore different clothes, They were definitely alien, definitely foreign. And the ideas of racial superiority and inferiority, which later come to dominate Nazi Germany, were widespread in this country. This was not something that only happened in Europe. In 1913, the Anti-Defamation Organization was found, Anti-Defamation League, as an attempt to counter anti-Semitic remarks that were going on in the country. The big impact on changing America and closing the doors came with World War I. I think most of you are aware of the kind of hysteria that got whipped up, anti-immigrant, anti-radical feeling during the war and after the war during the first Red Scare. What you may not know is that the first immigration law, including a literacy test, was passed during the war. It's the comprehensive immigration law. I hope you can read the form. Comprehensive immigration law. It included a literacy test, but it did leave one opening. It did leave room for people to come, to be allowed in, even if they couldn't pass the literacy test, if they were being treated for political or racial reasons. So Americans were still, in 1917, somewhat sensitive to that issue. By 1921, the Johnson Act was passed. The door swung even more sharply closed. This was the first of the quota laws. The United States Congress ruled that we would only allow in a maximum of 357,803 immigrants in a given year, which was quite a reduction from the large numbers that had been pouring into the country before. But it made a very interesting rule. It would only allow in 3% of the foreign-born population of that group that was in the country in 1910. So it's favoring the groups that had been here a long time against the newer groups. 3 years later, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed National Origins Bill is the one that completely closed the door. It was designed to keep out what one congressman called Bolsheviks, wops, dagos, kikes, and hunkies. On the floor of Congress, he said this. It cut the total immigration to 164,000, 2% of each Caucasian nationality who were in the country in 1890. By pushing the beginning date back to 1890, it was going for the time that the great Eastern European migrations had really come to dominate the migratory patterns. So it was basically ruling out, by quotas, the migration of more of the undesirable groups of Europe. Just a couple of examples. The Polish quota was cut from 31,000 to 6,500 between 1921 and 1924. The Russian was cut down to 2,712, the Italian to 5,800. But the fact of this could not be measured until later, since the quota for Great Britain, Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia, the traditional old stock countries, were never filled. And the importance of this, the reason that I'm putting this before you, is if you look at what the quota system would have allowed during the years in which the Nazis were dominating Europe, roughly between the 1930 and 1945, the quota system would have allowed 2.6 million immigrants into the country if all the quotas had been filled. Actually, only 560,000 people were ultimately admitted. So there were 2 million more unfilled spots on the quota lists than could actually get in. So when we're looking at the 1930s, as I will in a minute, about how the immigrants from Europe were trying to get out of Germany and out of Poland and out of Eastern Europe and into the United States, and the United States was saying, no, I'm sorry, our immigration laws will not allow that. The quota from filled. The quota from Great Britain wasn't filled. The quota from Ireland wasn't filled. But we were not in any mood at that point to do anything about it, for several reasons, one of which was the Great Depression had come along and millions of people were out of work. For a second reason, the United States had committed itself to an isolationist policy where it didn't like foreigners at all in any regard. It didn't want foreigners coming into the country. It didn't want foreign influence in the country. It did part of the League of Nations. And certainly we didn't want people to come in who were likely to become a public charge. So for the first time, the 1882 law, the first immigration law, which did have a public charge rider in it, was strictly enforced. That is, if you were an immigrant and you went to a consul in some part of Europe to ask to be allowed into the United States to get a, and it looked as though you didn't have any money or any means of support, and nobody in the United States was there to sponsor you, you were turned down. Well, the impact of this on the Jews in Germany was particularly severe. If you remember that the Nazis very quickly passed laws which took away Jewish property. So as the Jews trying to leave Germany would come to the consular office, there would be no way that they could prove that they had money, could support themselves, unless some organization in the United States was willing to vouch for them, and there were problems with that one as well. But we didn't need to worry, because as President Herbert Hoover told the country in October of 1932, right at the verge of the Nazis taking over in Europe, Herbert Hoover said, "With the growth of democracy in foreign countries, political persecution has largely ceased. There is no longer a necessity for the United States to provide asylum for those persecuted because of conscience or any other." So we had all the ducks in a row. We had our laws. There was no real need for changing the laws. And what it means is that by the time Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, the richest democracy, the largest democracy in the world, had committed itself to a policy of restriction of immigration and to a policy of isolationism. Uncle Sam was not going to get sucked into another war. We weren't going to let the merchants of death take us to a European conflagration or the international bankers. We weren't going to join the League of Nations. And the pattern that is set up here is not just an ideological one, it's a political one. Franklin Roosevelt came into the White House in 1933 at the same time that Hitler took over in Germany. What he faced not only was a depression, but it was a Congress that was stacked in favor of isolationism. There weren't any votes to be had for changing the immigration laws or changing the laws governing actions vis-a-vis other countries. So Roosevelt was faced with a choice, no matter what he wanted, and it's very difficult to tell what exactly he wanted. There was nothing much he could do politically. His hands were tied. If he wanted the votes of the isolationists in Congress for his political program and his economic program, he was beholden to them on not changing the immigration laws. And this pretty much governed the New Deal all the way through the 1930s. The New Deal did one other thing of importance, and that is it gave American Jews, who were becoming, by this point, politically mature, coming into their own in the country, it gave them the first taste of what it would be like to be accepted and to be allowed to share in the political power, the political process. The New Deal gave positions to Jewish professors, to economists, sorts of Jews who previously had been unable to find employment in government. Government didn't employ Jews. The effect of this was to bring the Jews solidly into Roosevelt's political coalition, but on the other hand, it meant that they were captives of the New Deal. They couldn't go and oppose Roosevelt. There was no place else to go. So when Roosevelt would not act on any of the atrocity stories that were coming out of Germany, when he wouldn't do anything to change the political stand of the United States vis-a-vis German actions or Hitler's actions in Europe, the Jews had no place to go. They were a powerless political minority. And there were a number of other things going on in the country as well, which I will attempt to give a brief cut of a video that I took on the Great Depression. If we can get the machine to work here. And if somebody will shut the light, I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of some of the anti-Semitic attitudes that were going on in the country, of some of the ways in which American life felt in the 1930s. The 30s was a very different place than the America that you're living in at this point. It was a much rawer place, very politically disorganized in terms of groups of protest on the right and the left. So let me start the video and see if we can capture it'll be exactly at the right place. Okay. I'm sorry about the tracking. We haven't been able to figure out what's wrong with it.
Actually, won the first fight with Joe Louis, and blacks following that very much distressed and humiliated. But they didn't have to wait long for a real triumph. And that was when Jeff Owens went to Berlin for the Olympics.
The 1996 Olympics would be Adolf Hitler's showcase for his racial theory of Aryan superiority over Jews, blacks, and other non-Aryans. By that time, Nazi law had stripped German Jews of their citizenship. Hitler was confident his athletes would triumph. He didn't count on Jesse Owens.
On the first day of the game, he fulfilled that station number 1 as their triumph ball. On the second day, he makes it a doubleheader.
Jesse was so popular, he had to use a secret entranceway and exit to go into the stadium and out of the stadium, else he would have been mobbed. He was just the most popular man, in addition to Adolf Hitler, in Berlin, beat the Olympic Games. And at that point, Jesse said, "Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals. I'm tired. Let Lloyd and Sam run. They deserve it."
Here in a smashing finale to a thrilling day of 400-meter relay sees Jesse Owens, lead-off man, blazing the baton trail for the American quartet and picking up a 4-yard lead. From Owens, the stick goes to Ralph Metcalf, second lane from the inside. The following
Used that to the Nazi cause and embarrass the German authorities, the Nazis, by having Jews stand on the winning podium.
2 months later, Avery Brundage openly praised the Nazi government at a rally in New York's Madison Square Garden. Hitler and his racial policies had already found a following in the United States.
troops dying in foreign uniforms.
It often bred hatred. While anti-Semitism was not new to America, by the 1930s there were over 100 hate groups in the U.S. The Black Legion, the Ku Klux Klan, the German-American boomed among them. No two were exactly alike, but many blamed the Jews for the Depression. The arguments ran 2 ways. Jews were either the capitalist bankers that ruined the economy, or they were the communist revolutionaries out to destroy capitalism. It was the Jew deal.
This Los Angeles bookshop with the silver shirts dispensing anti-Jewish propaganda is one of many that have recently opened all over the country. Note the name, Aryan Books.
Silver Ranger, Lake Neighbor. Free Street South by Jew Riot. Lake Neighbor. Free Street
At that time, we were able to count perhaps 35 anti-Semitic street corner meetings a week, telling the audience that Jews were taught by their Bible to...
All of these people would come to corners, not just the radical right, not just the fascist right, but the patriotic right as well. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolutions, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, were basically restrictionists. They were opposed to diluting America by letting in foreigners of any kind. Anytime you talked about raising the quotas, changing the quotas, you ran into tremendous opposition. In only 8.7% of the public said yes to the possibility of opening America's doors to more European refugees. 83% said no. My point is that this was an overwhelming majority in that direction, reflecting nativism, reflecting fear, and giving a good indication of what the political situation was at that time. American Jews were aware of the anti-Semitism around them. Make a statement, And the others would say, don't make a statement, let's protest privately. We can work with Roosevelt privately, we'll talk to him, we'll talk to his advisors. So in some sense, the Jewish influence was diluted, what little influence that there was. As the 30s went on, there was also another split in philosophy between those who felt that rescuing the refugees and later the survivors should be the top priority, and another strand in the Jewish community that was the Zionist in every way that he could, and he finally resigned and sent a major letter to the League of Nations and to other governments. In it, he said, when domestic policies threaten the demoralization and exile of hundreds of thousands of human beings, considerations of diplomatic correctness must yield to those of common humanity. He asked Jewish leaders to try to get the United States to accept 15 to 20,000 young Jews a year. Jewish leaders went to the administration. They went to all of their Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt administration sent it to the State Department. The State Department sent a reply back saying that there was no Jewish quota. There, at a maximum of 25,000 Germans of all faith without reference to religious beliefs could be admitted to the United States. The State Department was completely avoiding the question, as they continued to do throughout the next 10 years. They completely avoided the fact that one group in Europe was being threatened with exclusion, with handed about it. We can't let in just Jews. We must keep the door open, even though nobody's filling the quota. The United States merely pledged to continue its quota. In 1938, there was a conference, the Evian Conference, which is listed up on the sheet there, on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. It was to deal with the refugee situation. 32 nations came to the conference, and nothing came out of it. The only thing that came out of it, that no area, the United States stands by its quotas. The United States is unwilling to use its influence in all of the Western Hemispheric countries, from Canada on down to Latin America, to open up space for these refugees. They don't count. They're not important enough. I think the best example of this came in 1939, when several European countries began to recognize that a lot of the refugees were children who were orphaned or who were terrible. The bill never even made it out of Congress, out of Congressional committee. It never came up for a vote. The anti-immigrant coalition was so strong, even in the face of this particular situation, where every answer had been found to any one of the possible questions. Arguments ranged from seeing the bill as an attempt to undermine the quota system, to not letting America become the dumping ground for the persecuted minorities of Europe. The refugees, quote, have a heritage of hate, said legitimize. I have one more section of video. It's going to take me a minute to find that, if you'll bear with me just a second. Okay, I think I'm about at the right spot. Somebody catch the lights again, please. It may be a little bit before what I wanted to get on, but let's see if we can. The magic isn't working. I'm sorry, it's not going on, and I can't see what the problem is.
Said that the government to now overlook the forgotten in order to care for the undesirables of other nations. That spring, while the Wagner Orphans Bill was pending in Congress, America was confronted by another refugee crisis. 937 Jewish refugees was turned away by the Cuban government. For a week, they sat within sight of Miami, while they appealed to the U.S. State Department for emergency aid to rescue them.
They never made it. They never made it because they didn't want more Jews, though there were less than 1,000. The attitude in the White House was that they could do nothing about it in face of the existing high barriers in the immigration requirements. At the end of several weeks, that ship...
Political issue, just like the anti-lynching law, something which FDR had to leave to the congressional leadership, and it failed of passage.
Mrs. Roosevelt was terribly frustrated that certain things didn't happen. And she wished to God it weren't so, but it was. And in the end, she made people understand why progress was slower than they hoped it would be. She also told them...
Plausible argument, except that there are ways of checking for spies. There are ways of screening people. There are ways of putting them in holding pens in camps and finding out what kinds of people they are. None of these were tried because the visas were turned down from the moment that they tried to get into the country. By the time Long had his operation going, the other thing that Breckinridge Long added to all of this was a rule, the relatives rule, which essentially said anyone who has a relative in Europe under Nazi control, in an area where where the Nazis have control, is potentially usable by the Nazis as a spy. Now, think about the implications of that. All of these people had relatives in Europe. That's why they were trying to get out, because the Nazis had swept up their relatives and were trying to get them. Relatives rule was an even more effective way of screening people out. There was an appeal process. If you were turned down for your visa, you could appeal. And then there was a screening committee, 3 levels of appeal screening. When people who were the sponsors of proposed refugees went before the screening committee, people in the United States, citizens of the United States, to say, yes, I will speak in favor of letting in this person or this person here. We can't let these people out, because then there'll be pressure on us to change our immigration laws, and who knows what might happen. Who knows how many people might try to get out. Another State Department official, Borden Reams, in 1943, this is after the final solution was already known. The government knew that this had taken place. When he was asked to negotiate with the Germans to release more Jews. He said, while in theory any approach to the German government would have met with blank refusal, there was always the danger that the German government might agree to turn over to the United States and to Great Britain a large number of Jewish refugees at some designated place for immediate transportation to areas under the control of the United Nations. Neither the military nor the shipping situation would have permitted such an action on the part of the United Nations. In the event of our admission of inability to take care of these people, the onus for their continued persecution would have been largely transferred from the German government to the United Nations. The World Jewish Congress representative in neutral Switzerland, Gerhard Riegner, notified the U.S. Consul that he had received hard evidence in the way of documents, of photographs, of materials, of the existence of a secret German plan for a final solution. He asked the American consul in Geneva to send a cable immediately to Washington notifying the American State Department and American Jewish leaders, because as this was wartime, all from the American state, but from the British. They got it from British Jews who had learned it from the British Foreign Office. In September and October of 1942, Jewish leaders in the United States, once they had learned of this situation, were asked by the State Department not to say anything publicly about this, because they wanted to verify whether or not this was a believable thing. The reports began coming in from other sources, from not just Jewish sources, but Polish government in exile sources, Swiss sources, independent sources. In November, on the 24th of November, 1942, Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles called Rabbi Stephen Wise, the Jewish leader, into the State Department and said, quote, I regret to tell you that these documents confirm and justify your deepest fears. There is no exaggeration. So this is on November 24th, 1942. The American government was fully in control of all the information it needed to make that kind of judgment. Rabbi Wise held a press conference that evening confirming that more than 2 million had already been killed in an extermination campaign aimed at wiping out all the Jews of Europe, and that the Nazis were in the process of moving Jews from all over Europe to Poland for mass killing. There was some press coverage of this in the United States, not incredible press coverage that you might expect. Curiously, though Franklin Roosevelt held news conferences twice a week, he was not asked a question about this for more than a year. No reporter asked the president whether this was true, what the United States was doing about it, weren't doing something about it. The only ones who began trying to move on this knowledge were the American Jewish organizations. The American Jewish Congress managed to have, in early March of 1943, a mass meeting in Madison Square Garden where 20,000 people were inside and 50,000 people were outside. The mayor of New York, Mayor LaGuardia, spoke to the thing. They came up with an 11-point proposal pleading with the American government to take some action. The proposal included such things as Germany and the satellite governments to secure arrangements for the Jews to emigrate, swift establishment of havens of refuge by allied and neutral nations, revision of U.S. immigration procedures to permit full use of quotas, some agreement by Great Britain to take in a reasonable proportion of Jewish refugees, agreement by the Latin American nations to modify their extremely tight immigration relations, guaranteeing financial support and bringing in the International Red Cross to help feed the Jews remaining without further delay of a commission to assemble evidence for war crime trials and determine the procedures for them. This 11-point proposal went to the president, and it went to the State Department, and you can guess what happened with it at that point. In March of 1943, Jewish organizations began holding major rallies in a number of American cities. They called them "We Will Never Die" rallies. They all ended with the chanting of the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer of the dead. The efforts brought only one response. Both in Britain and the United States, there was enough public outcry to force the government to try to appear to be doing something. So the British government proposed to the American government a conference on refugees, another conference. The first conference at Evian had done nothing. Another one was to be set up at Bermuda in April of 1940. Again, as predicted, nothing came out of it. The reasons for that were many. Roosevelt had nothing to do with the conference. He was busy trying to fight the war and deal with his political problems. No Jewish organizations were allowed to participate in this. The State Department people who were sent all opposed doing anything about it. Only 5 news correspondents were allowed to attend the conference. The conference was prohibited of making any special emphasis. There was no discussion of approaching any of the Axis satellite countries to find ways of prying the Jews who were remaining in those areas out. There was no discussion of British policy in Palestine. The conference met and spent most of its time dealing with a very small number, about 5,000 Jewish refugees who were stuck in Spain, and figuring out how to get transport for them to North Africa. The effort was to totally de Jews. They knew this most horrible information that they could conceive of had been confirmed, and nobody would do anything about it. So if you think back to Arthur Kessler saying the screamers go on screaming, and nobody does anything. The war aims, as defined by the United States government, were to win the war against the Nazis. And the argument that you were always met with when you went to the government to say, but what about the Jews, was that the Jews will be better off the quicker we beat the Nazis. Not toward elevating any one group to prominence and draining any scarce resources off to promote them. I think the least you can say is that the catastrophe was not comprehended. The depths of what was going on was non-thinkable. It was only in 1943, after the failure of the Bermuda Conference, kind of action took place. And it took place inside the United States government. The Secretary of the Treasury was a man named Henry Morgenthau, Jr. Henry Morgenthau was a German Jew, a prominent Democrat, and a decent man. He became aware, remember, he's the number 2 ranking man in the cabinet of the United States government. he became aware from people coming to him that something weird was going on in the State Department, that there was this office that was locking up all the quiescence government in the murder of the Jews. It was a terrible indictment of the United States for its actions and inactions in this whole situation. Henry Morgenthau changed the title to make it a little more palatable, and then took the report to Franklin Roosevelt. And this happened at the very beginning, January 24th, 1944. So we're almost in the last year of the war at that point. Roosevelt could no longer deny the reality of what the Jews in the United States were operating in a context of powerlessness, that the United States was isolationist and anti-Semitic in deep ways throughout most of this period. The Jews were captives of the New Deal, had no real political influence. The Jews themselves were terribly divided, but that doesn't seem to be a feature. Had they been united, it's doubtful that they could have done anything else. The events in Europe, as I said, were outside the normal realms of comprehension. There was a failure of imagination and moral sensibility on the part of American leaders. Were terrible, and I think we bear historical responsibility for what we didn't do. As I said at the beginning, I think there must be a special place in hell, and I hope Breckinridge Long is doing very well right there. I don't want to blame the whole thing on Breckinridge Long. I think he reflects an attitude, a stance, the type of country that America was at that point. And I hope we're beyond that at this stage. Was still a British of destruction against Jewish synagogues, Jewish people. I think more than 30 people were killed in that period of time. There was an excuse that they used, but the basic thing was that mobs of Nazi hooligans began breaking into Jewish homes, Jewish stores, and it was the clearest kind of a message that they weren't fooling around, that this was going on. And it hit the press around the world, in the United States and elsewhere. It's one of those events.
A lifetime. The next generation is totally uninformed. If we sort of say never again, but what are we doing about it? It isn't just the Jews, it's hate that seems to have sprung loose everywhere. I'm 70 years old today. I don't know how much longer I can talk about it or have a dialogue with people. How do we get together in order?
They couldn't speak politically because of that fear. It was a very, very real fear.
Yeah, tremendous fear of calling attention to yourself, of asking for anything special, of going during the war. A great many Jewish leaders hesitated to go to the government and say, wouldn't you please pay attention to the fact that Jews are being slaughtered in Germany, because of this very same feeling. How can you ask for special treatment at a time when millions of people are dying? You know, there's something selfish about it, isn't there, to do that? But I think what I would say, that especially as the war was going on, that the situation had reached a point where it was out of bounds. Normal thought processes, normal actions could not work. You couldn't stay in them any longer. Yeah.
At the end of the war, once some of this information was given out to the general American public, was there any type of backlash?
No. At the end of the war, when the camps were finally opened in 1945, when the Western armies came into the concentration camps, there was a tremendous amount of play in the press. The pictures and the horror of it were there. Eisenhower went in to see the camps and was horrified, and it got a lot, and do something with it, trying to set them up, their own agendas and what they're doing. No, there's no single mechanism. The only thing I think we can hope for is that the response of the public would be sufficient to jar the government into action. In its normal state, government bureaucracies are not going to do anything that's going to risk losing votes for the administration. So, especially if there's a heavy coalition in one direction, they're not going to act against it.
You know, in Congress, that it takes a long time for Republicans to affect what's happening there. I mean, you know, the majority
Right.
Just as an example,
Well, there are many more current examples. I think we can lift it right up into the present day with the reaction against immigration that's going. What about the treatment of the Mexican immigrants in California and in Western states? What should the United States do in the former Yugoslavia? Should we do something about ethnic cleansing? These are very complicated questions, and they raise all sorts of issues about what's moral, what's possible, and what role we should play in the world. Remember, we've spent the past 40 years as the dominant power in this. We defined right and wrong very clearly and said, they're wrong, we're right. The communists are bad. So we divided the world along these lines, and we patrolled it according to our moral understanding. Whether you like our moral understanding or not in the Cold War, that's what we set up. It was a crusade, and we pushed it all the way to the limit. And in some ways, you can say we won. So now we're in the post-Cold War world, where the new morality of what we should do and shouldn't do what's here anymore, and we have all these very mixed up feelings, complicated feelings about it. Maybe we shouldn't be doing anything out in the world. Maybe we should close our borders. Maybe we should put a lot more money into the border police to keep out the illegal aliens. There's a strong sentiment in those directions. Phil?
I'm scared myself, not only by the United with the Holocaust, but by our own tendency to overlook the weak minority groups. You've mentioned a general anti-immigration attitude towards Mexicans. A case in point that I think comes much closer to a sort of mini version of the Holocaust is the situation in Haiti right now, where we have turned away, I'm not sure how many thousands, would-be immigrants from Haiti into the United States because we say we can't possibly take them in, they'd be too much of a burden on the public purse and so on. And we have sent them back to a place where we know, just as Roosevelt and the government and the American public knew annexation and possibly death. And yet, how much are we doing about it? What is our government doing about it? You know, Clinton and the State Department bring their hands this way and that way. Sometimes they blow hot on irish tea, sometimes they blow cold, and the whole thing goes nowhere. I'm reminded chillingly of the situation we described in the early 19th.
Yeah, I think the late 30s and the early 40s are parallel to this situation in many ways because a clear line has not emerged. We haven't a non-activist or an isolationist or not isolationist, what we're going to do in these situations. And you're right, the Haitian situation is probably the closest analogy. There are people getting eaten by sharks whose little boats are getting swamped and our Navy's not picking them up or we're sending them back. And now we can use AIDS as an excuse.
So what have we learned?
Yeah, it's very hard for populations, large populations, to get a way that they can cope with it and break it down. It's much easier to focus on one individual. If somebody is being attacked, you've got a moral question in front of you. Should I do something? Should I call the police? Should I try to stop the attack? People get excited about this. The news every night is filled with individual cases of people who do something or don't do something. When it gets into these mass situations and these political situations, it's a very chief feature of what they do. But to organize pressure, that's the only other lesson that I think you can take. If large enough groups of people start raising their voices and making their points of view known, things can happen. They won't always happen, but they can. The war in Vietnam was brought to an end because of public resistance to what was going on. It can happen. It took the disruption of the entire country to do it. Jewish riots led by in the region and didn't want the possibility of a Jewish state to emerge. So she may be talking about that. I wouldn't classify it as a Holocaust. I would classify it as warfare between different factions over the same piece of ground. But I don't think it was an extermination campaign in that sense. Yes, ma'am.
I was working in Chicago in the 30s during the war.
But poignant one, that in the 30s, in the midst of the Depression, she felt, and people she knows, just lucky to have a job, just lucky to be able to put food on the table, not too concerned about big politics and big issues, and I think that's the way most people live their lives. It's a state of, it's not ignorance, it's not bliss, it's something else. It's a state of just focusing on what seems to be before you and the issues that are there. One comes, or should come, to the realization that what you do or don't do has greater impact, and that's really what the Holocaust should have brought us to an awareness of. That, to me, the biggest lesson to come out of this whole business that I've been talking about today is that we cannot be an isolationist country or people who are isolated level.